The question, was coinage invented in India, seems pretty simple. Surely it is a yes or no answer. But historical questions are rarely so straightforward, and historical answers, at least competent ones, are never straightforward. In this case, what precisely do we mean by invented? If, and it's a reasonable way to interpret the question, we are asking where the very first coin was made, then no, that did not happen in India. The very first coin was probably made in China, sometime between 700 and 600 BC, or maybe, a little bit less likely, in Lydia, that's in modern Turkey, towards the end of that range of dates. Coins did not appear in South and Central Asia until a bit later. Some people think a century or two. I will come to the date in a moment, but it's not the main issue for today. We're also, for clarity, not talking here about coin-like objects. Either things that look like coins, such as tokens or medals, or other physical representations of money, commodity monies, though the lines between those objects and coins are pretty blurry, and at the very origin of coinage, they were probably very, very blurry indeed. The question here, and it is an important one, is whether the first person to make a coin in Central or South Asia had seen coins and was simply adapting an already existing technology used elsewhere, or whether coinage in South Asia was an independent idea. That is the sense in which I am using the word invented. And the question matters if you are interested in why human beings invented coinage at all. I will explain why at the end of the episode. Let me start by pointing out that what is known as punchmark coinage, the native coinage of India, is obviously independent of the other two major traditions, the Lydian and the Chinese. It is not simply that these coins do not look alike, but that their design and manufacture is conceived of fundamentally differently. The punchmark coins are, as the name implies, made with punches on one side. The Lydian by driving the coins into a die, and the Chinese by casting. They are manufactured respectively from silver, electrum and copper, have different shapes, cut from sheets, made from lumps of metal, or resembling tools like knives or spades. And they use different iconography, symbols on the punchmark coins, images in the Lydian tradition, writing on Chinese coins. I am not going to contradict this. This initial impression is clearly sound. The argument is not if India just wholesale adopted the coinage of another region. It clearly did not, or at least not until centuries later when it adopted die-striking technology. But is there a more subtle chain of connections? Did the first people to make coins in Central and South Asia already have some information about how they worked and adopted that into a local practice? We will look at two numismatists today, Mitchiner and Cribb, who think that is what happened. First, let us talk about dates. In the 19th and for most of the 20th century, most historians thought the coinage of India began about the same time as it did in China and Lydia. This was based on the study of Buddhism. Buddhist texts attributed by the tradition to the lifetime of the Buddha talk about coins, so it was assumed that coins already existed in the Buddha's lifetime. And since that was generally dated in the 6th century, it made sense that coinage had probably originated in the 7th, the same time as it did elsewhere. For example, this sculptural relief from the Bharhut Stupa, kept today in the Calcutta Museum. This was probably made in the 1st or 2nd century BC, and it's the earliest surviving depiction of this story, the buying of land for the Jetavahana monastery, which the tradition says happened in the lifetime of the Buddha. The story goes that the purchase price was to cover the land itself with the money used to acquire it. In this case, we can see the workers laying out a carpet of coins. Is this an accurate depiction? Today, we suspect a lot of these stories are anachronistic interpolations. That is, someone who lived in a society much later that did have coins assumed that a past society used coins for money, especially in this case where other versions of the story exist without coins. Remember, not all money is coin, not all coins are money. And in the last half century, there has been a tendency to date the Buddha's life quite a bit later, perhaps in the 5th or even into the 4th century. It's a hotly debated issue and not one I have ever looked at closely. But you can imagine that these shifts, suspicions that the stories are late, and a forward movement in the date of the Buddha, have undermined confidence in the antiquity of Indian coinage. So let us approach this from a different angle. The standard catalogue most people will be familiar with of punchmark coins is Gupta and Hardaker. And for a lot of people, this type of small, square coin with 5 punches on it is the type they will think of first. But these are actually only a part, and they represent the later part of the punchmark coinage. They are known as the Imperial Series. The earliest are found in the region of Magadha and subsequently expand to encompass all of North India. In the process, they displaced a wide variety of types issued in different places. Those are known as the pre-Imperial series. We have a rough idea of when this happened. Sometime towards the end of the 4th century BC, the Mahajanapadas, that is what the Buddhist texts call the collection of small states they set the life of the Buddha in, are replaced by a single large imperial power, what becomes the Mauryan Empire. You can probably go to the literature on this and find some pretty confident assertions of specific dates. Be very cautious. We don't know exactly how or when this took place. We know, for example, that Seleucus I, a Hellenistic ruler, and Chandragupta, the first Mauryan emperor, were contemporaries. But a lot of what you will find in secondary literature, like these Wikipedia articles, are speculative fantasies. We do not, for example, know if Chandragupta actually established an imperial power or, as a later tradition in India would have it, simply took over an existing one, or the nature or pace of that imperial establishment. What we can be reasonably sure about is that by 300 BC, the imperial coinage had displaced the pre-imperial. That is our terminus antiquem for the pre-imperial coinage, though of course it doesn't tell us how long a period the pre-imperial coinage covered. Let us look at just one of those pre-imperial coinages, the coins of Kashi. They look roughly like this, relatively large with 4 circular punches on one side. The punches are in 2 pairs. A quick note on Kashi, that is not a secure attribution to a particular political unit. It is just a convenient label we use for this series. The reason Kashi is important is that the 2 scholars we're going to talk about, Michael Mitchiner and Joe Cribb, think that this is probably the earliest coinage in the Gangetic Valley, but not the earliest coinage in South Asia. They think the earliest coinage was issued on the borders between modern Afghanistan and Pakistan in the Kabul or Taxila region. On a map of Eurasia, those look very close together, but they are actually some 500 to 1,000 miles apart. Despite that distance, there is a marked numismatic similarity. The coin next to the Kashi coin is a bent bar, issued somewhere in the northwest. Ignore for the moment the small marks. Those are counter marks. They were added after the coin was issued, and they are probably important, but they are not the main point now. The bent bar coinage is quite different from the Kashi in form. It is a thick bar rather than cut from a thin sheet, but the pair of punches are essentially the same 6-armed symbol. Cribb draws this conclusion from the similarity. The relationship between the bent bars and the cup-shaped coinage is so close that the cup-shaped coinage must have been copied from the bent bar coinage. Mitchiner concurs. Don't worry too much about the terminology. Cribb simply uses cup-shaped to denote the series I am calling Kashi. They also both assume that the bent bar coinage can be divided into an early and late phase based on the shape of the coins. Long, thin coins are late, and thick, wide coins, in which the punches partially overlap are early. For both, a key piece of evidence is the Tchaman-i Hazouri hoard, found in the vicinity of Kabul and published in 1953 by Curiel and Schlumberger. The hoard contains a mixture of coins, a type essentially unique to that hoard, which I'll come back to in a moment, examples of the short, stumpy, bent bar types, and importantly, coins from the Greek tradition, an offshoot of the Lydian, which can be dated. Cribb writes as follows: the Greek and Iranian coins in this hoard were mostly of the 5th century BC, except one piece which is derivative of an early 4th century BC Athenian coin. This hoard cannot have been deposited until after 360 BC, when the Athenian type coin was first issued. Okay, that's clearly correct, and it means that short, dumpy, bent bar coinages must have still been available after 360 BC. But does this mean they were only issued in the 4th century? Cribb believes so, but is duly cautious and writes, "It should be noted, however, that the dating provided by the Tchaman-i Hazouri hoard does not provide a date for when they were first issued, or when they were first available as a prototype for the cup-shaped coins. It would not be impossible to push the date of their first issue into the late 5th century BC. There are some assumptions at work here, but first let me turn to Mitchiner's argument, which is slightly different, based primarily on typology. Like Cribb, Mitchiner agrees that the earliest coins are the bent bars, and that they are the prototype for the Kashi coins, but he finds in the Tchaman-i Hazouri hoard an inspiration for the bent bars. The local coins in the hoard are round and thick. They are made by driving a large punch into the back, and they often have indistinct marks on the front. In isolation, we would call these die-struck coins. But one of them has the same 6-armed symbol as the bent bars. Mitchiner further divides these local coins into a sequence. He assumes that the local coinage of the hoard begins with a type which featured 3 small punches on the reverse, and he points to the use of 3 images or symbol-based punches on the coins of Miletus, one of the electrum coinages in the early Lydian tradition. Thus, he creates a typological chain from the invention of coinage in Lydia through the electrum coinage of Miletus to the local coinage of Kabul, on to the bent bars, and into India through the coinage of Kashi. I do not find this entirely convincing, but Mitchiner does present this in the context of the most detailed account of pre-imperial coinage currently available, his 2-volume work on early trade, so it needs to be considered, and that is a volume anyone interested in this problem would need to consult anyway. I'll come to my specific problems in a moment, but one reason to be cautious here is the risk of cultural biases affecting your judgment. There is an excellent article prepared by Goyal in the late 1990s, so it doesn't cover Mitchiner, which surveys the historiography on this problem, and you cannot help but notice the tendency for scholars based in India to project the date backwards, further than the evidence we've just looked at will support, and for European scholars to be dismissive of an independent origin. And I think in a very subtle way that does have an impact here. There is just a lot less research, and thus a lot less solid data on South Asian coins than there is on the beginnings of the Lydian or Chinese traditions. There are die studies for some of the Lydian material. There is a hoard from an excavated context at Ephesus. In China, there are multiple early mints which have been excavated. But for South Asia, all we have are a handful of general catalogues, which means there is a lot of room for assumption. Take the relationship between the bent bars and the Kashi coins, both Mitchiner and Cribb assume. How do we know that this is the direction of influence? Yes, Mitchiner points to a few Kashi coins that feature just a pair as a connection. But as with most typological influences, they could work the other way. The Kashi coins could have inspired the bent bars, or the long thin types both the short versions and the Kashi coins. Even the assumption the Kashi coins are the earliest in the Gangetic Valley is precisely that, an assumption, a reasonable guess based on limited data. And I think Mitchiner's assumption about the local Tchaman-i Hazouri coins is particularly unlikely. There are subunits of the Mémoires that feature a single punch. It is much easier to imagine a coin tradition that uses a single device, adopting that device from one that uses multiple punches, rather than vice versa. Why would someone who had seen a die-struck coin be inspired to make a punch mark? Yes, it's possible. Swedish plate money of the 17th century is an example of dies being used on a large piece as pseudo-punches. But it's not the most plausible direction. Superficially, it is more plausible that the Tchaman-i Hazouri local coins were being simultaneously influenced by two different traditions, the Lydian and the punch mark, i.e. the coins in that hoard are a meeting point, not a missing link between these two traditions. I cannot offer you a definitive answer to the question of whether the South Asian tradition is independent, but I did promise at the beginning of the episode to answer why this matters, why it's important. Well, do you care why coinage was invented at all? Lots of people do. It's a very popular question. It's a question I get very frequently when I'm speaking with people who have a general interest in the history of money. There's a lot of literature on it. And the critical thing is, you cannot answer that question, why coinage was invented, unless you can answer this question, was it independently invented in South Asia? And Cribb has tackled it in print. Cribb compares the Lydian and Chinese traditions and looks for areas of similarity among the differences, assuming those must be the common factors that lead to the invention of coins, a process known as Mill's method and a mainstay of comparative study. He finds that common element in the varied designs and concludes the objects were originally not coins, but commodity money, and that the treasury marked them for its own purposes. And only later, when other users began to give preferential value to the objects the treasury had marked, was it realised that this could facilitate the monetary system and the objects became coins. It is one of the more interesting ideas on the origin of coinage proposed in the last 20 years, but I am sure you are already well ahead of me in spotting the problem. It depends on the first coins having varied designs. That is true in Lydia and in China, but it is staggeringly untrue in South Asia. The designs in South Asia are extremely repetitive and conservative. If India independently invented coinage, then any comparative analysis of the origin of coinage needs to include it, and Cribb's explanation no longer works. And that is why the question of whether the punchmark tradition is truly independent or derivative of the Lydian matters. A final word on the subject. I've laid out a basic problem here and some of the key works. They're in the text below in the comments, so if you want a reading list, it's right there. But no one really cares what your opinion or my opinion on the invention of coinage is. The fundamental problem is not Eurocentrism or sloppy reasoning or a lack of insight. The problem is insufficient evidence. We don't have a good catalogue of finds of pre-imperial punchmark coins. We don't have a catalogue at all of the little countermarks I pointed out to you earlier. There are no punch studies. There's no good metallurgical analysis of this material. There isn't even a really good metrology of these coins. And no piece of research will be useful unless it begins to fill some of those gaps. We need that research because if we cannot answer this question, we cannot answer questions about why coinage was invented at all.